Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LoCoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LoCoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and I'm back with Rick for part 2 of the anxiety podcast. And if you guys didn't listen to the first part, I would highly encourage that you do that. We go through just some of the basics of, what is anxiety, how is it represented, how would you feel with anxiety, and kind of like when it is normal versus when it might be kind of bordering more of an anxiety disorder. And this one is going to be a little bit more of the practical coping strategies to deal with anxiety, because like we talked about in the first one, it's very normal. It's never going away, so don't wish to wake up one day to never have anxiety again. It's a terrible plan. It's actually setting you up for failure. So how do we cope? Oh, I didn't say your fancy title.
Oh yeah.
I had to fuck it up.
Sorry.
Okay, hold on. So Rick is our licensed mental health consultant. Okay, I had to say it.
I feel like we need a little bell every time you say it correctly to reinforce it.
It's four. I almost said 3 words. It's 4 words strung together. That's a lot for me to process. So intros and outros are not my thing. All right, now you can go. Now that you've had your introduction, everybody knows you can go.
All right, cool. All right, so back on anxiety. We're talking about the treatment of anxiety now. So hopefully you'll get some practical tips out of this, and not just more of the same of what you've already heard. So the first step is we have to start bringing awareness to our own anxiety. And so what do I mean by that? Awareness is talking about anxiety, but it's more than just talking about it. It's paying attention to where the dangers are. What are the dangers? What are the things that we're really afraid of happening? We have to make a conscious effort to acknowledge the fear that we're facing when we're talking about anxiety. And what I mean by making a conscious effort and talking about anxiety, so if we take a specific event, whatever that event is, for lack of better options, I guess let's say like a competition of some sort. I don't care if it's bodybuilding, jiu-jitsu, a basketball game, whatever it is. If the person is experiencing anxiety over this, we want to take that particular experience and we want to start acknowledging the actual dangers that exist within it, both real and unreal. Particularly, we like to focus on what are the real threats, but sometimes you have to allow people to process even the irrational part of their minds. And why do we do this? Because it lends itself into what the overall kind of concept is of this. And so what I'm going to do is like kind of tell you a little story. You ever seen like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old kid at the beach for the first time, and that 2-year-old is so excited to see the ocean and the sand, and they just take off running for the water, right? And they're running and they just want to get in that water and they want to play.
No.
That 2-year-old, that 3-year-old is ignorant to the dangers that actually exist. They don't understand currents and riptides and the power of the waves, and they don't know how to swim even at that age. So they're unaware of the dangers. That doesn't make them brave, that makes them naive. And so what we want to do is we want to get people to the idea where you can understand the dangers that exist, because the trick to getting through anxiety is not to make you less anxious. It's to help you become braver, more courageous, stronger, right? Less anxiety is a way of saying I can look at a situation and understand that the world isn't a scary, dangerous place. That would make anybody less anxious. But that's not what we're really going to do. The idea of it isn't to make you a less anxious person. The idea is to make you a stronger individual, a braver individual, someone with more courage, because this will also lend itself to how we kind of view ourselves later on. I'll kind of walk us down that path. So yeah, you don't want to be the 2-year-old just running out there. Like all the adults are, in the room would be like, oh my God, you can't do this, and here's why. And this is where I feel like a lot of people are starting to lose their grip, their kind of grip on, I don't want to say reality, but how to deal with things. Because as parents, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to take our kids and we're supposed to actually expose them to dangerous things. But along with exposing them to it, we teach them how to manage it. And this is what helps a person develop into a healthy, natural person. Nowadays, everybody wants to take everything that's dangerous and shield them from it to protect them. And all we're doing is we're creating future anxiety problems for individuals. So the idea isn't to protect somebody so much that they never experience anything bad. The idea is to actually expose them to dangerous things and to teach them to cope with it, but age appropriately. So really the idea is we don't become less anxious, we become braver, we become more courageous. And this seems like a small distinction to make, but the reality of it is it has huge implications. So when I'm working with clients that are coming from a traumatic experience, trauma survivors, and there I just kind of gave it away. The difference is when a person first comes into my office and they've gone through a traumatic experience, whatever that experience is, the client is sitting there and a lot of times they are in a victim mentality. They're like, this is my fault. They blame themselves for things that were not their fault. I should have known better than to walk through that garage. I should never have trusted that person. And so they're blaming themselves, and they go through this process of completely victimizing themselves and finding out things that weren't within their control or things that they really, no one would ever think about, and they blame themselves for it. But through the course of treatment, we take that experience and we rewire it, and we teach that person, hey, you're not actually a victim, you're a survivor, right? And even just saying that, like your people who are listening to this at home or wherever you are, the difference between being a less anxious person or being a braver person, the difference between being a victim and a survivor, you can actually have physiological differences just in you feel yourself feel differently about just saying those words, right? And so that's the switch, that's the kind of mindset that we want to take is, hey, I'm not going to be a less anxious person, I'm going to be a braver person, I'm going to be a stronger person, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. There's a difference in that, and it relates to what we were talking about before. It's that perception. You can take the same number and look at it from different perspectives. It's either a negative experience because I'm looking for the negatives in it, or I can flip it around and find all the positives from it and grow from it and get better from it. So for
Would
me,
you say that the victim mindset goes the other way too, right? Like not like, let's say it wasn't a traumatic event, right? But then somebody puts themselves in a situation where they're like, oh, I'm the victim of my circumstances, and it's like, no, you can actually rise above this. Like you have all of the power to get above this, right? Like I don't know what the counter to that would be because it's not Survivor, but like say you're in an anxiety producing situation and you feel like you're the victim of this, and then you just basically like feel very defeated and don't, I guess, react negatively. Like what is the counter to that? Because I think that that's a really important thing to talk about too.
Circumstances and situations are not always within our control. I can't control what's going to happen when I walk out of this building.
No. Stuff that you can control.
Okay.
So like say like basically somebody saying like I'm the victim to like I can't stick to this, whatever it is, right? Like I can't stick to this diet.
Right.
And they have this victim mentality over it, when in reality like there's a lot of things that they can control.
Sure.
But I wouldn't call it like, oh, you're a survivor of this. Like it's
that's a person who's looking for a backdoor. Okay. And they're looking for excuses and reasons to why they don't want this to work. That's them saying, how do I feel today? I feel like a 7. Well, why am I a 7 instead of an 8 or a 9? Well, now they're going to identify all the negative attributes with it, why I can't do it. They'll give you a litany of reasons as to why they can't accomplish this. But it's not really the situation. You are within control of it. So what's holding you back? Where is this mentality starting to come from or creep in? And I almost feel like people are more comfortable with failure than they are success.
A lot of people.
And so,
or if they get success, then they like almost sabotage that because they're
self-sabotaging is a very real thing.
Yeah, or like they didn't see themselves, I feel like, up here, and then they just try and knock themselves down because they're like, oh, I should actually be down here. And maybe that one time was like a fluke, or like, you know, even though they put in all of this work and all of this effort and they actually deserve to be up here, they bring themselves back down because of that fear of like, oh, well, I was successful once, like, do I have to be successful again?
Right.
Like, it's scary to be up and then come down. But if you bring yourself down, then it's like, well, it was my fault.
And there's no expectation for a failure, right? If you've succeeded and you fall, like, it gives people something to talk about. And it may make you feel shameful that you can't get back to that same space. You know, and I think people are just really comfortable with failure. And they've gotten to a point where, well, if I just tried, that was enough. And it's like, on some levels, that is enough. But the reality is, if you're using it as a way to sabotage what you're doing, is using it as an out to not necessarily like be vulnerable, to put yourself out there, then you're just trying to avoid what it is. And a lot of times people will like to point to things that are out of their control because it makes the situation easier to digest. Because if I admit that I just don't want to do it, I'm somehow weak. And it's now my fault, and I have to take responsibility, and that's a really scary word, responsibility. No one likes responsibility. Everybody wants to run away from it. You start throwing around words like responsibility, and people like get mad at you. So you have to be careful, and that's one of those moments we talked about before, like where and when and how to push a client, when to be empathetic, and when to kind of call them out and be like, hey, I think you're using this as a way to avoid really dealing with the situation. You're afraid of this or whatever is standing in the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah. So the victim mentality, we want to create that. We want to get rid of that victim mentality. We want to take it from I'm a victim to I'm a survivor. And when I ask clients to do this, sometimes we do exercises throughout, where I say, all right, let's go back to your whole life. When were you a victim? I start trying to challenge them to be like, well, how can you view this differently? Like, now you're a survivor of it. So like, what does it mean? And what we find is that it starts to associate new meaning and purpose in their life when they look at it from that different perspective. It becomes like a badge of honor. And that's why, like, every sports figure, you never hear about the people who come from like the good upper middle class families. You always hear about the kids who made it out of like the worst possible conditions ever because they're somehow better because they made it through these adverse conditions. So in our minds, we want to create, when we're talking about anxiety, the difference between I just don't want the threats to go away. I want to learn how to manage them, and I want to be braver with it. So clinically, let's talk about what we really mean, and that what we're saying is we don't want to be ignorant to the dangers that exist. We want to acknowledge those dangers exist. We want to know that they're there, but we want to develop the skills to get around them. So when we're talking about anxiety from a clinical perspective, and we're starting to create a map on how to deal with it. Anxiety is always bigger in a person's mind. And when it stays in your mind, it stays trapped there, and it is allowed free reign to roam and move and grow bigger and more vast and so overwhelming that we can't possibly begin to deal with this. But when you sit down and you talk to somebody and that other person is a sounding board, it's not a therapist, it's a friend, fine. So that friend can help, like by talking about it, what we're now doing is we're bringing awareness to it, and by defining it. When you define something, you set limits on it. You start creating this idea that it is not so vast and so huge and so overwhelming, but it is a problem that can now be addressed. So the first step is getting people to talk about their anxiety. What is it that's making you afraid? Voice it. This should be your wives, this should be your husbands, these should be your kids or your friends or your teammates or your coaches. These are the things that they need to know in order to start helping you, to start supporting you. They're not going to fix it for you, but they can help in reinforcing the strategies that you develop. They can help and be like, yeah, you don't do well with this, or you've done well with this in the past, and you're thinking about it like this, but isn't this similar to what you went through as a kid or as a young adult? And you're like, yeah. So now you have like different people to help you with this, and that's kind of the support that comes with it. So the first part is talking about it, defining it. When we define it, it becomes manageable. We set limits on it. It's no longer this abstract thing, right? So that's kind of the first step. And so intuitively what it does is it reduces the magnitude and size, and it immediately starts to make it more manageable. And that's what we want to do, because when we don't keep our anxiety in check, when we don't talk about it, it's that shadow figure that's growing in the room, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it causes people to do crazy things. And I'm sure as a coach, you've seen this play out where people can't handle the anxiety.
Yeah, and then what ends up usually happening is something seemingly small happens, right? And that's kind of like that tipping point, right? Like the proverbial tipping point at some point will happen. And you've kind of seen things building up, and you're trying to help, but maybe you weren't getting the full story as a coach. And that's where actually one of the most important things about really asking the right questions on a weekly basis with clients has really benefited me. Like learning, okay, what are the questions that I actually need to ask? And what do I need to like read through these responses to like actually figure out what's going on with them? Because if you don't ask, a lot of people aren't going to tell you. There are going to be a subset of people who tell you just things because they want to. There's also a subset of people who will never tell you really anything. But in the middle, most people, like if they're prompted, they will let you know kind of like what's going on. So learning to ask those right questions and kind of get there before that tipping point is so important. And for people to feel supported and to actually come up with strategies instead of just being like totally blindsided, like, wait, when did this happen? Why did this happen? And unfortunately that still does occur, right? Because it is a human relationship, and sometimes people, you know, hold things back, or they don't tell you, they tell you part of the story, or they tell you maybe what you want to hear, right? That's happened in coaching relationships too. And I'm like, listen, you don't need to tell me what I want to hear. Like, I actually want to help you change this. Yeah. So because you think that I want you to do a certain thing is actually false. Like, I don't fucking care. We need to fix this. Like, it doesn't matter what you did. I need to actually know that though, so we can work on it, instead of just telling me, like, to appease me, like, hey, yeah, the plan you set in place, like, I'm doing it. That does neither of us any good, because then I'm thinking everybody's fine, everything's hunky-dory, like, you're following the plan, like, you're doing great. And then a few months later, I get, like, blindsided with something that's like, whoa. So it's, you know, a lot of it is, like, asking the right questions beforehand, being an open person, and just, like, facilitating those conversations. But sometimes, you know, you're going to get, it's going to happen, and like those tipping points occur. It's like, okay, now we really need to kind of peel back. What are these issues? And those are those uncomfortable conversations. Like, it's very uncomfortable, especially because, you know, I am close with people, but they've also maybe known me for 3, 6 months, a year, maybe. Like, it's not going to know them their whole life, right? So it can be hard for some people, but once they do open up about what's going on, like what we're, you know, because typically whatever is anxiety producing or provoking for them is not really the issue. Like, that's like a small subset of the issue. Like, the issue is very, very deep, and it's down here. Sometimes it takes just months to even like figure out what that is. Sure. But that's what we need to get to. Like, I need to get to the basement of like whatever is causing these problems, because you telling me it's this one thing, that's not it. Right. Like, and how many times they tell you it's one thing, but it's something completely different. And sometimes you have to be harsh with people, like, hey, like, that's not the fucking problem. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, what is it? Like, tell me. And then finally you hear it, and you're like, oh, that's what it is. That's what we need to work on. Yes. Bring me to the fucking basement. Have you seen Inception? Yes. Oh, it's like, it's the basement, or like the bottom of the elevator. God, that movie's fucking insane. I love it. Anyways, I'm always going to think of that now. All right. So... You get so upset when I derail you. Step 2. It's a perfect segue. Step 2, floor 2, and Lauren's elevator. So step 1, anxiety is bigger when we don't talk about it, right? We need to talk about it so we can define it. So step 2 is, now that we know where the anxiety is or what the anxiety is, and we can define it, and we've set limits on it, and we've explored it, now what we begin to do is begin to break it down into manageable problems. Right, so we're taking this really big bad thing and we're breaking it down. And I actually wanted to kind of reference a post you made earlier this week. I think you were talking about, you had posted 2 pictures side by side. I think it was a competitor from 2018 and 2020. And it was like, we have a long-term vision, right? And if we think about anxiety as that long-term vision, that huge, vast mountain, whatever it is, then you're like, but along the way we set these strategic goals. We set smaller, obtainable goals that we can accomplish. And treatment of anxiety works in that same way. You've defined it. You now know what the mountain is. But now it's like, okay, what's the strategy we need to get up the mountain? So now we're not looking at the mountain anymore. We're looking at very specific things. Well, we need boots, we need gloves, we need certain gear, we need these things. This is breaking the problem down, right? So, is that similar to what you do with your clients when we're saying, hey, the person's coming in and they're like, I want to be a professional, or I want to lose weight and I want this kind of body? Is that similar to the process? Yeah, it's pretty much, that is our process. We say, okay, what is, you know, we even ask on their initial intake form, like, what are your short-term goals? What are your long-term goals? And typically most people's long-term goals are something that they can achieve. The short-term goals are often the ones that are maybe like incorrect or not in the right context, right? And it's like, hey, I have this long-term goal, but I want to do this crazy thing in a few months. It's like, hey, like, let's bring it back. We're not going to probably be able to do that. But what we can do in the context of this big goal is set up these small strategic goals. Because if you just tell people like, hey, you know, give me 2 years of your life and like, you'll have a banging body. They're like, okay, 2 years. That's a lot. Like, I'm not really going to buy into this, which is why those quick fixes are they're so damaging, but they're so like alluring to people. Right? Like, oh, 8 weeks, I can change my life, of course, right? Instead of what's actually going to happen is now you're going to repeat that cycle for God knows how many times and be in a worse position in 2 years. Where if you actually just invested 2 years, there would be so many like better benefits, and you actually have this long-term result. So basically it's the same process. Like long-term goal, hey, here's what we want to do, here's what you want to do, but here are the small strategic goals we're going to do along the way. And for a lot of clients, like, we work on not only, of course, like, you know, diet and training, but also like mindset and just like behavior things that they're doing, because that's a huge thing that a lot of people run into over and over again, whether it's self-sabotaging their goals or whether it's just like having like just a shitstorm of a schedule or like terrible habits. They basically always fall off and they fall into those same issues. Okay, so what is this issue? Like, we need to break that down and actually develop a system so that you don't fall into this. But that takes a long time, and that's not like a really like fun, sexy thing to talk about. But that's the reality. And it's like, hey, people want every week to be this like groundbreaking update, and it's like, listen, I hate to break it to you, but every week is not going to be super exciting. And if you report to me like, hey, had a pretty like basic week, like made these good changes, I'm thrilled. You know what I mean? Like, we deal with the hard weeks when we have to deal with them. There's going to be really high, exciting weeks, but most of the weeks are going to be pretty basic. But then you're going to look up in 6 months and have a completely different outlook, and a completely different, you know, whether it's mindset, physique, whatever it is.
Yeah, and so that's essentially the same thing that we're going to do with anxiety. You know, the anxiety might be preventing them from doing something, but by breaking it down and saying, okay, how do we start to decompose this? How do we start to break this down into smaller, more manageable things? And suddenly we start chipping away at it. But so once we've talked about it, we know what's scary to us. The next step is, you know, decomposing it, breaking it down into those smaller, more manageable tasks. Then step 3, as I work with my clients, is really starting to develop strategies to accomplish these tasks, right? And so that in and of itself can be a little bit of a task. It's like, okay, now it's not a big scary problem anymore. It's a series of small problems that I can accomplish, right? This is no different than making a list throughout your day. Usually on your day you have like 6 or 7 important things, right? Well, you start your list with like the 3 things that are easiest to do. Why? Because it creates like this theory of momentum, right? Well, I've accomplished a few things. Well, that's what anxiety is, but you also need to develop strategies for dealing with these things. You can't just say like, all right, now I know it's a manageable problem. Okay, well, how do I go deal with that manageable problem? So what tools do you need? How do I start this process? This kind of lends itself into when you're working with a therapist that you trust, and hopefully the individual is trained and understands, like, there are ways that we go about doing this. Like, for example, exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is one of the ways that we start working with clients in tackling anxiety. So if you're, stick with your elevator, people have a legitimate fear of getting on an elevator, right? This is like true story.
So I like that with escalators, so yeah.
Okay.
Are you surprised?
Not at all. You know, what's the strategy going to look like for this client? So like, it could start with visualization in the office. You know, it's like where you have the client close their eyes and, you know, you start creating this script of like what it's like, and as you're walking up to the elevator and you're pushing the button and you're seeing the numbers light up, like what are you feeling? And you can actually create these responses in your office. You can watch people start to pant and breathe heavier and like fidget in their chair and like get really uncomfortable. And it's like, and then you bring them back down and you work through this process and you keep going through it until eventually you tackle that one small box and you're with that person who knows what they're doing, and you kind of very slowly and methodically start exposing them to these things. There's another treatment method called flooding. I don't recommend flooding. Flooding is like,
that sounds terrible. Hey,
I'm afraid of snakes. Okay, I'm gonna throw you into a pit of snakes, right?
It's like fear factor.
Yeah, like, no, that creates trauma for a lot of people.
Oh my God.
There's safer and easier ways to do that. Now the alphas that are listening to this right now, they're like, yeah, give that to me. You know, they're like, I'll do it.
Hell no.
But that's a terrifying experience for most people, and that's what creates future clients for me.
So like, hey guys, so we can set up a system with like flooding and send me the exposure therapy.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who really swear by flooding and they think that's you know, a really great thing. But
I'm just thinking of fears that I have that are completely irrational, but could flood a room, and I want to die thinking about that.
Yes, but by exposing a person to what they're afraid of. What we're starting to do now is we're actually flipping that. I'm becoming braver, not just less afraid, right? I'm becoming a stronger individual. My courage is growing. And this is a really substantial moment for the client, because when you look at whatever the event is that is creating that fear, right? The idea is to get them to think about it differently, but it's also about getting them to think about themselves differently. And that they not only understand that this is a manageable thing, but that it's something that they can actually accomplish, they themselves can do. And so it can be really scary for a person who's used to failing, who's used to using excuses, to back out of therapy at this point, to back out of the progress that they're making, to sabotage it, to take a break, to do whatever. I don't have the money, or whatever the situation is. They come up with these excuses. But being braver means that you're recognizing the dangers that exist, you're acknowledging them, you're validating those fears, but you're choosing to move forward anyway. And this is where, our competitors who, when they're getting ready to go do something, to jump up on stage and to pose and to compete in front of people, like this is that moment. Like, you've been working up to that moment. And for some people, even probably listening to this, they can be like, yeah, that's terrifying. Like the lights and the stage and all that kind of stuff, it's frightening to them. So they're like, yeah, no way, I could never do that. And it's so funny, even though they want to do it.
When you bring up like the elevator thing, and you can like physically see people start like getting nervous. So something that I do when I do my posing lessons is, so we'll go through, people have like an individual routine, right? Where like nobody's speaking, they're just on stage, like they're doing their routine. But then there are times when like you're with other people where the judges are telling you like when to move, right? Like face the back, or look at the curtain, or quarter turn to the right, whatever it is. And I will pretend be the judge after we've typically had like a session or two, or if somebody's, it depends on, of course, like where they're at. But let's just say after a few sessions, I'm like, hey, like I'm going to pretend to be the judge, and we're going to go through this, and I'm going to have you move. I'm going to call out your number, and you're going to move here, and you're going to switch with this person, and whatever. And literally, they could have been nailing their routine. And then as soon as I come into the picture, mind you, I'm on a screen, on Zoom, like not even with them, and I start pretending to be that judge, the routine falls apart. Like almost inevitably, I would say 9 times out of 10, the routine falls apart the first time we do that. And I say, hey, like, did you notice how that felt? Like, and they're like, yeah, I don't get it. We just did this. And I'm like, it's because for whatever reason, like now it's becoming more real. Like this is what's going to happen. So like you're kind of in the situation where like it's, oh, hey, I'm going to be directed by this person. I'm not just spinning around in the room by myself. So it's so interesting to see, like literally even on a Zoom call doing posing, people start breaking down just when it's like more real to like what that exposure would be. And the exposure, and I always go back to this, but like we have so many clients who have food issues, so like that's why I just always bring this up. But like the exposure therapy is something that we basically do with food a lot. And like whether somebody has like a trigger food, or they have, the idea of like eating out or eating off of their plan, whatever that looks like. We basically have to have very small exposures. And I can't just tell somebody who's been tracking their food meticulously for years, like, well, just go eat a burger. That doesn't work, you know what I mean? And at some point you kind of have to flood them and say, hey, like, go try this, go fail. I want to see where you failed, why you failed, and we can make adjustments. But you do have to make adjustments along the way. So sometimes like, it's like, okay, we've done this for a few weeks, it's clearly not working. Why don't we pull back a little bit, and here's some exposure to it though, right? We're like, hey, like, just take the scale away for a meal, and I just want you to like eat what you would normally eat, but without a scale. And like those kinds of things. And it is very anxiety provoking for people. And sometimes they go one way or the other. They like completely like restrict again, and they're like, nope, I have to restrict, everything has to be exactly perfect. Or they just completely fall off the deep end. They're like, I don't know what happened. Like I woke up and I pretty much ate everything like the house. So it's like these two very wild responses, and like obviously my goal is for neither of those to happen. Sometimes it does happen because you've pushed people, but at some point I feel like you have to push them, and so you can't just baby people forever either. You know what I mean? Like you have to say like, hey, like look at how this is like creating all of these issues in your life. Like this is serious. We need to address this. You should be able to go eat. You should be able to go have this food in the house without feeling the need to eat it every time. Now, again, I'll always say this as a caveat. If you're prepping for a physique competition and you're at extremely low levels of body fat, not really the best time to make a judgment call and like, oh, I'm having issues with food. Pretty much everybody's going to develop some kind of disordered issue with food. And typically there's foods that people like, peanut butter is a big one for competitors because it's super hyper palatable, it's salty, it's sweet, it has fat, like it's easy to eat, it's calorie dense. So like people end up, oh, this is a trigger food for me. It's like, yeah, if you're a week out from a show, a lot of foods are going to be trigger foods for you. But like in a few months, like let's revisit this. Like, can you have peanut butter in the pantry? Or are you like a year removed from a show and still can't have it? That's going to be an issue.
Right. Absolutely. And so as we're getting to that, like I'm becoming braver in taking these risks. What we're really doing is we're acknowledging that the world is a dangerous place, that these fears really do exist. And really what we start to see is a switch from it being, the mindset being that this isn't an anxiety that I no longer control, but like you kind of flip the switch into like this is now becomes a voluntary challenge. right? And so what we begin to see is like this theory of stressors. And there's a difference between an imposed voluntary stressor versus like an involuntary stressor, right? So if you took two groups of individuals, okay, you separate them, group A and group B, but you give them the same stress. But group A views this as something voluntary and group B views this as involuntary. Well, group A, the voluntary approach system views it as like, well, I'm going to take this on as an approach and as a challenge. And as a result, like positive emotions come from it. And those positive emotions create more energy. It's less hard on your body. And you aren't using as much of your defense mechanisms and that posturing that occurs with it. Versus you take that exact same stressor and you put it over here when it was involuntary. And now all of a sudden, like this system, this mindset kicks in of defensiveness, of avoidance, to withdrawal, right? So this is where those excuses start coming in as to why I can't succeed in my weight loss, why I can't do the competition, why I can't continue with something. And what you begin to see is there's the negative emotions that are associated with it, right? And so like, it's the same stressor. It goes back to what we were talking about. It's like, how are you viewing this? And the people who, it's not that stress is the issue, it's how you're internalizing that stress, how you're thinking about that stress. Is this voluntary to you? Do you get up? Can this excite you? And that's kind of the steps that I take with my clients is like, look, we've taken the stress from being, we've talked about it. Now we know what dangers exist. And we're going to break it down into small and more manageable tasks. Now we're going to develop a strategy for those tasks. And it slowly starts to build their confidence. And they get behind this, especially if it's an anxiety that they really want to overcome, right? And now we're starting to expose them to it. So they're gradually getting braver. And so what you see is this huge shift in their mindset. And now it has become a challenge that they're accepting. And that this is what changes their whole perception of it. And this is what makes it exciting, and this is what gives them the validation that they're looking for. And this could be anything from getting on an elevator so that the person doesn't feel like a freak anymore because everybody's making fun of them and no one understood the fear that was happening with them. And that person getting on an elevator would be like you standing on the tip of, Mount Everest with a somebody getting ready to push you down on a snowboard. You'd be like, I can't do this. Like, no way. Like everybody's fear is going to be different.
2020's not over yet, so I might.
Yeah,
if you don't hear from me for a while, that's what I'm doing.
That's taking social distancing to a whole new level.
It's a really great escape plan. I actually like this. How do I avoid all my problems? Oh, snowboard down Mount Everest. Okay.
Yeah, and so what this does is this actually innately starts to improve a person's, like I guess you'd call it self-esteem, right? Going back to what we were talking about. And seeing yourself taking risks, regardless of the outcome, is more important for your development as a human being and for how you view yourself. And what's great about it is you acknowledged the danger and you moved through it. You attempted to navigate it. Maybe you didn't succeed, maybe you didn't take first place or whatever it was, but you weren't naive. You weren't some child running into the ocean anymore who didn't know the dangers. You knew the dangers, but you took the risk anyway. So what this does is it creates a substantial example in your own life. So when you're alone, it's not just some crazy rationalization of like, oh, I'm a better person or whatever it is. This is something real that you can set against yourself. This is something that when fear and doubt start to creep in, you have an example from your own life. And it built that courage, and it's not just some hypothetical thing, like you view yourself as a worthy person. And this to me is like kind of the essence of it. It is finding what makes you worthwhile as a person and expressing it. Viewing yourself, the ability to observe yourself overcoming challenges and observing the courage within you is what gives you the strength to move on, is what gives you confidence, is what helps you achieve most of the goals we set for ourselves. And that is like such an important part of therapy, because it's like sometimes it has less to do with the actual event that's causing anxiety, but more to do with building the human being up, building this person up. And this is what is like these methods that I'm teaching or that I'm describing right now is what parents should be doing with their kids, right? Stop hiding your children from everything. Stop protecting them from everything. Stop telling them that the world is a safe and fair place, because it's not. It's a dangerous place. It's an unfair place. Give them the tools they need to do it. And if you don't know how to do that, find somebody who does and start using this process of talking about it, defining it, breaking it down, developing strategies, exposing yourself to it slowly, and make sure you're coming from that mindset that, hey man, this is a personal challenge, because it'll change everything for you.
Once I found the stress perception research, like it was just mind blowing to me. And of course, like you kind of innately know about it, right? But then, or like you see people in action with that, right? Like you see people who like, whenever stressors come up, like they fucking rise to that challenge, like they do really well, they excel. And then you see people who literally fall apart, you know, with stressors. And I started seeing that more and more, like as a coach. And then, you know, once I kind of stumbled upon this research, I was just like, wow, like, this is so fascinating. Like there's literally research down to the hormonal responses that people have. Like literally the hormones used to create, whether you think stress is a challenge or you think stress is harmful,
are
different.
Yes.
And that is so absolutely insane to me. And when I found that, again, sometimes like, you know, I think science is great. Like, did I need a paper to show me that? Maybe not. But it just really showed like how profound it actually was. And that's where all those chronic issues come from. You know what I mean? Like if you're only secreting cortisol and you're not secreting DHEA, you don't have those things to balance out, that's going to run into some issues. You know what I mean? And that's like where we start to see not only the psychological issues, but physiological issues as well. Like people who have a very negative stress perception, I just started seeing like these trends. Like they typically have very poor gut health, or they just don't process foods as well, and they just typically have a negative outlook with a lot of things, and they just don't respond as well. And I was like, why is this happening to like these specific people? And I started breaking down, okay, what is happening? Like, how are they thinking about things? Like, what is their personality? Like, can I identify anything that's unifying? Because they're all very different people with very different backgrounds, but they all had very negative stress perception.
Right.
And the people that I saw, and there's of course there's people who have negative stress perception who have no physiological issues. But if you've had it for long enough and it's gone unbridled, you're going to run into some issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And so some final notes that I want to talk about, like from a competition perspective, people who are getting ready to compete. Whether you're dieting for or competing in physique competitions, or whether your clients are people who are like, I want to get stronger so I can compete in football or basketball or track, whatever. I want to kind of talk about the mindset of an athlete, not just a mindset really, but how to apply these principles to getting people to perform better. And the mistake that a lot of people make is the event in and of itself we build up. Remember I said in our minds, stress is always this or anxiety is this huge mountain, and people build it up to be so big. So like a great example of this is, most people are familiar with Michael Jordan. Well, early in Michael Jordan's career.
If you're not, you should Google him.
You should. But I want to give you guys some kind of context for this. So when Michael Jordan was in college, he talks about how there was one particular basketball shot that I think it was it was the shot that he made that sent them to the finals, or it was the shot that won the finals. I don't remember. It doesn't really matter. But the clock's winding down. He gets the ball, and it's a jump shot. He makes the jump shot. The team goes on to win. And so when you look at that, you're like, God, there was such pressure. And when you start to evaluate that, let's look at it from an anxiety perspective. And you watch that 10-second clip of the ball being passed around, Jordan gets it and he shoots it. And you look at everything that's encompassed in that shot, right? You've got the lights and the announcers and the rivalry, and it's March Madness and the announcers, and everybody's been building this up, right? And it's huge, and these rivalries that have gone back 30, 40 years since the inception of, the universities or whatever it is. And so you have all these things that are creating this mountain of anxiety, right? And so you almost watch it and you're like, how could any mortal even do this? But then there's another video clip I would encourage you to go to. Go to YouTube and type in Come Fly With Me. It's a Michael Jordan documentary. It was produced years ago. And the very beginning of the documentary starts with Michael Jordan by himself shooting a basketball in a gym. And when you look at the jump shot that he took, and then you watch him shooting hoops in the gym by himself, you realize that there's nothing different between these two situations. It's the exact same jump shot, right? What's changed? Everything around that jump shot, the audience, the crowd, the teammates, your coaches, your parents, the lights, the sponsors, all this stuff. They're the ones who have created it. And so our ability to strip those things down and to take it from being this really big thing to something that's manageable is really important. There's a jiu-jitsu coach, a world-renowned jiu-jitsu coach. His name's John Danaher. He talks about, there's this kind of story, he calls it the parable of the plank, right? And this is kind of what he does. He talked about when he was a kid in school, and they brought this like daredevil over to his school, and the guy was doing all these different tricks. And one of the tricks that he did was he took this plank, and he took the plank between the two school buildings, and he walked across the plank, and he walked across it again. He did it like 3 or 4 times. And so the kids are like in amazement, right? And they're like, this is amazing. How could anybody do this stuff? And so what happens is the daredevil or stuntman comes down, and he puts the board on the ground, and he says, all right, kids, I want you to all get up, get in a line, and run across this board. And so all the kids run across the board. And he's like, you just did what I did. He's like, the only thing that's different is I just did it from a slightly higher perspective. And the message is the same, is it's like, what has changed? It's the same plank that this guy just ran across. They just ran across it with no fear. So what's changed is your ability to kind of decompress everything, to compose it and make it into, this is a manageable task. One last example of this. I read a lot about the military. I work with a lot of veterans. One of the things that's fascinating to me is special operations. I was watching a video sequence and reading some books on how Navy SEALs train. And Navy SEALs are by far and away pretty much considered the top and the elite, right? You have Delta Force and reconnaissance and all this other really tough dudes. So I'm not saying anything bad about that. But one of the things is, when you look at the 6 months worth of training that goes into becoming a Navy SEAL, and like that's just their basic buds, right? They call it. Yeah. When you look at something in its entirety, there it is, like 6 months of this. So you go through 1 day worth of training, and you're like, oh my God, I've got 6 months of this? Like 5-mile swims, 20-mile runs, obstacle courses, drill instructors yelling at me, rolling around in the sand and the dirt, and being cold in the ocean and all this stuff. And so you're like, you take that 1 day and you're like, oh my God, this is 6 months. Like, no way, I'm going to quit. And so you quit. But what you see is they use this term called evolutions. And there was a film crew filming them one day. And the film crew's talking to one of the cadets. I don't know what they're actually called. One of the recruits that's going through budge training, and Navy SEALs in training, I guess. The trainee, let's call him that. And he's like, what do you think of this? He's talking to the guy, and the guy's like, I just need to get through this evolution. He's like, I'm not looking at tomorrow. I'm looking at this evolution that's right in front of me. And it's like, right there. It's across all these different things. You're talking about basketball with Michael Jordan. You're talking about jiu-jitsu with John Danaher. You're talking to a Navy SEAL. What they're doing is they're compartmentalizing things. They're saying, look, it's not the bigger picture that matters. It is what is right in front of me. How do I break this monstrous thing down into something that makes sense? And it's just this amazing cycle that keeps repeating. And this is how they're dealing with anxiety. The guys who make it through buds and become Navy SEAls, they're the ones who learned how to do that. They aren't looking at it as a huge feat. They're looking at it as, I just have to do this one task. And if this one task is getting through the obstacle course, I'm going to get through the obstacle course.
It's so funny. Like every Navy SEAL I've ever talked to, when you say like, people just bring up training or whatever, they're like, training, like that was the easiest thing we did. If that was hard, like that would be concerning. You know what I mean? Like nobody cares that you fucking pass buds, right? Like once you pass it, like, congratulations, like you did the bare fucking
you joined the rest of the guys who already did that, so you're not special anymore.
Like it's literally they're like, it's so easy in comparison to what you actually do, right? And it's pretty wild, like what the SEALs do as far as like, especially for the deployments, like they typically do like 6-month deployments, but like 18 months of training, like 18 months of training for 6 months away. And obviously they have very intense missions that they're going on, but it's just It's you can learn so much from the military. It's something that I never really like looked into like younger. Like I didn't really have anybody military in the family. Like you just feel like you just don't really look into that, like unless you're brought up into that culture. And like now I have, and it's like, wow, like, this is so, you can really learn so much just from like having that mindset. And even the clients that we do have who are in the military, they're all badasses. You know what I mean? And like they have such great stress perception. Everything that's like would be seemingly stressful to other people, they're just like, okay, got it. Yeah. Good to go. Like,
I saw an interview with one guy who was getting ready to embark on this, this really serious training, and he was asking a guy who had gone through the training, like, what do I expect and this and that, and he was, anxious, and you can see the anxiety because he's asking all these questions. He doesn't know what to expect. And the one guy responds with him, and he says, look, man, the best piece of advice I can give you is, he says, nothing will happen today that you can't handle. And like I remembered hearing that, and I was like, like this light bulb kind of clicked, and I was like, God, how do I take that and I implement that with my clients? And I was like, just that phrase in and of itself. And I literally have that on my wall in my office. And I say, nothing will happen today that you can't handle. Because if you're looking at today and today only, what's right in front of you, anxiety doesn't produce as much or as strong or as intense. And so it becomes much more manageable. And so when you take these kind of lessons, and I like to tell those stories because it covers like this wide spectrum. It's not just jiu-jitsu, it's not just physique, it's not just basketball, it's like all aspects of life. And your ability to relate to people is important, especially as a therapist. So it's the same message they're all giving, whether you're talking about a plank, whether you're talking about Michael Jordan's basketball shot, whether you're talking to a Navy SEAL. Like, it's the same message. Focus on the evolution, focus on what you're doing, focus on the task that is right in front of you. Develop a strategy for that task, right? And don't look at the big picture sometimes. Don't look at the 6 months or the year or the 2 years that it's going to take for you to build your body. What is Laurin asking me to do? She's asking me to do these 3 things. So I'm going to do those 3 things. And those 3 things will lead to this, and all of a sudden 6 months in, you're like, hey, I can see some differences. You know, I love looking at those before and after pictures that you post. Like, I'm like, oh my God. Like, I can't, like, in 2 years, they went from that to that. Like, it's amazing to me what people are able to accomplish. But they didn't get there without those small incremental things. And you can't look at the big picture sometimes. You have to focus on the small little details that you can control, that you can manage, that you can develop strategies for. So I'm hoping that this is something that's useful to your clients, not just people who are competing, but just generally managing anxiety in general.
This affects everybody, you know, and that's why I really wanted to do this kind of deep dive into anxiety, because it's one of the most prevalent things that I see with clients, really everybody in the world, right? Like, people can learn how to handle their stressors better, and typically when people don't have a handle on their stressors, it's because they have a lot of anxiety, or they have anxiety and some depressive symptoms, or even, you know, full-blown depression, which we are going to do kind of a breakdown like this too, because I think it's so important, and they're often intertwined in, you know, I don't know if you see that all the time too, but I feel like a lot of times it's almost,
people who are anxious are definitely depressed, and substance abuse and vice versa. It all goes together. It's meshed together.
It is different. It's very distinct, but they do go together. So I'm excited that we'll do that as well. So yeah, I think that was really great. And if anybody has any other questions, of course, please let me know. And as always, you can reach us at teamlocofit.com, and we will catch you guys next time.